Okay, and I'm just going to go ahead and introduce. Hello, my name is Abby Lovett, and I'm with the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program at the University of Florida. Today's date is March 13th, 2021, and I'm at my home in Gainesville, Florida, joined virtually by Mr. Jack Levine, founder of the Four Generations Institute, which is an advocacy organization. And could you please state your name and date of birth for the record?
Yes, Jack Levine, 6/26/1951, June 26th, 1951.
Okay, so that makes you are you a Gemini?
Cancer.
Oh, all right. So where were you born?
Long Beach, New York, a suburb of New York City, about 30 miles east out on Long Island.
Okay, and did you grow up there or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, so my whole childhood was there. My high school years were there, and I didn't leave there actually until I was in my young 20s.
Okay, was that for college?
Yep, I went to school at a city school, city college in New York called Hunter College in Manhattan.
Okay, awesome. So you shared with me that your father immigrated to the US from Russia. So I want to start out, before we get into your life, I know he was a huge influence on you. So I want to hear a little more about him. First, can you start, did he tell you anything about his childhood growing up there or what life was like for him?
Well, Tsarist Russia was a very, very difficult place to be, a poor and a difficult place to grow up because of the reign of terror that the pogroms brought to the little villages. They were called shtetls. My father was born in 1891. So when he was 15, there was a failed attempt to assassinate Tsar Nicholas II in Moscow. Now, my father had nothing to do with this, but the attempt was, it was actually a bombing of the Tsar's sleigh, and he wasn't killed, but he was made very angry. So he created a set of raids on the villages out in the country because he never trusted those people. They were mostly Jews. They were mostly, all of them probably were poor. And if you picture the movie or the play Fiddler on the Roof, this was the era, this was the time, and that was the place. So when this failed attempt happened in 1905, my father was between 14 and 15. Sets of horsemen, they were called Cossacks. They were basically a military force under the rule of Tsar Nicholas. They raided the villages, and they had authority to ransack the homes, molest, rape the girls, and kill the boys. That was their mission. They actually would run the boys through the woods as human target practice. Well, the word got out, and my father, all of 15 and a half years old, and his friend Benny, a peer of his, they escaped with their lives, packed their little burlap sacks and went west. Took them 3 years to get through Poland, and then got on a ship in 1917 to come to the United States.
Wow, well, that was quite a year, 1917.
No, he was 17. I didn't mean.
I see.
It was 1908. He was 17.
Okay. Sorry, that was my confusion. I was like, wow, that's a
I might have misstated it.
Oh, you're okay.
Yeah. So that was his immigration. Left his entire family. He didn't have a big family, but he left his entire family, and there were literally hundreds of thousands of Eastern European and Russian Jews who came to the United States during that critical period between 1905 and World War I. And my father, of course, was just one of the many.
Right, and he was lucky to get out at a time when they were still accepting so many Jewish immigrants and Eastern European immigrants in the United States, because that really changed after the Bolshevik Revolution. So he has a very interesting perspective because there's not a lot of people who were able to escape that situation, especially Jewish people with the pogroms, and then obviously all of the violence that followed that. So it's really incredible. So what about the rest of his family? Did anyone else make it?
No, he never had any touch with any of the rest of his family. It was basically a complete severance. He didn't have any siblings. There were cousins, maybe an uncle or two, but he never saw his parents again, and that was a sadness. And of course, the ability to communicate then was really, it was impossible unless there were, letters to be sent, and who knew if they were ever going to get there, especially once World War I broke out. So these little villages were basically decimated. There were populations of about 200 in his little village called Shekhanovich, but they were completely annihilated. This was just a reign of terror brought on by the subjugation, but also brought on by World War I.
Right, right. And there was this rising tension. I know Jews were often associated with communism and that threat, even obviously unjustly, most of the time. So that was, I'm sure, probably part of the reason that they were targeted, right, after that explosion.
Yeah, they just weren't trusted. They were different. They had a different religious practice. They looked different, and usually when monarchies are threatened, they need to find a source of
scapegoat.
Yeah, scapegoat. That's a good way of saying it. He came. He was a teenager. Found some work doing some sewing
in New York.
In New York, yes, and very, very rapidly he made a kind of a set of friends. He came over only speaking Yiddish and some Russian. So he had to pick up English, and he ended up borrowing some money and starting his own business in 1914, which was in the stitching and pleating business. And he built that into a quite successful business with some 20 to 30 seamstresses at one time. And frankly, got very involved in public policy. He didn't call it that. He called it causes. And one of his causes was labor rights. Now, one would think if you own a company, you're not going to be into workers' rights. But he felt very sincerely that to keep his workers, he had to make them happy. And that was his philosophy. And that whole growth of his sensitivity and ability to communicate what was needed. A very big event happened. He was one of the observers on March 25th, 1911, to the Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire. A fire broke out. It was a weekend. My father was one of hundreds of people on Green Street. That's the color green with an E at the end. It was the name Green. And he observed there were over 200 workers, all females, in this factory. They were on the 8th and 9th floor, and 165 approximately perished in that fire. What happened was the owners of the factory had all the exterior windows locked, and all the interior stairways were also locked. That was the practice, and they were even in an inquiry, they admitted that they did that, but they were unrepentant. They said these girls were not there to see the light of day. They were not there to take breaks. They were there to work. And that horrified a number of people, but it also obviously horrified my father. And he made a pledge as a 20-year-old that if he ever had a business, he would treat his workers completely differently than those perished workers. The archives of the Triangle Shirtwaist fire are at the Cornell University, if anybody wants to check it out. It's really an amazing story, and was credited by bringing on the big ladies garment worker union at that time. Really a monumental event in the history of labor rights.
It was, my advisor for my thesis that I'm Dr. Ortiz, who I'm working with on the whole Dozier School research. He actually is very interested in that particular incident. And he was telling me that anti-Semitism was at play there as well, that there were some higher ups in the company who believed that the Jewish women working there were liable to steal from the factory. And so that was also part of the reason, at least he told me, that they made the decision to lock the fire escapes, which is it's really tragic, especially, considering that particular group's background and how much they went through to get to the United States, only to suffer from that severe neglect. So yeah, that's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, we can check this fact. I'm almost positive that the two owners were themselves Jews.
Really? Huh. That's interesting. Well, that's definitely something to look into. I don't want to get too sidetracked, but that is, so your father witnessed, he was right there on history's doorstep. He witnessed that.
Yes, he would tell the story. He heard the screaming. Some of them actually leapt to their deaths. They were lined up on the sidewalks. There are still photographs of this. And it was quite shocking. It was a Saturday afternoon, and there it happened in front of his eyes. And again, there were hundreds of observers. The tallest ladder for the New York City Fire Department at that time was 5 stories. So there was no way to get to them.
They were on the 8th story, right?
8th and 9th, yeah. The irony of that tragedy is many facets. It's an amazing event that had tremendous ramifications after that. So I'll tell you another kind of quick glimpse of my father. So he got involved in these causes, and he started to write columns in several of the Jewish newspapers, the Yiddish newspapers, but he never did it under his own name. He picked up some pseudonyms, and these were columns about social issues, not only workers' rights, but things like voting, the whole idea that, the subjugation that he survived in Russia. He did not leave his passions in the woods of Russia. He took them with him, and he felt it was important for him to get his opinions known. There's a little family tale of one of his colleagues, they called each other cronies, came to his shop one day with this printed column, and he showed it to my father. He said, did you ever see this column? It's in the newspaper about once every couple of weeks. And he said, did you read this? And my father glanced at it and he read it. And the friend said, nobody really has met this author. There's a suspicion that he doesn't really exist by that name. And my father kind of just looked right in his face and he said, well, I never met him myself, and it was one of my father's columns.
Right. Wow.
And that whole era of running a business. He married, had 2 children. His wife died. He raised 2 children as a single father. As the decades went by, he really was a remarkable man. For many of his abilities. And then in 1940, 1942, one of his workers and he started dating. Their first date was the grand opening of the movie Casablanca. And he always used to say that was a tough ticket to get, but it was worth it. And within about a year, they were married. And shortly after that, in the early 1940s, my father's blindness came on. And he actually turned blind within 24 hours. They suspected that it was vascular in his brain. And he did not give up the business when that happened. But of course, he was, severely disabled and needed to have a different lifestyle. So after the marriage, my older brother was born, my full brother. And 7 years after that, in 1951, I was born. So you would say that at age 60, and that's an era in the early 1950s when 60 was kind of old. That was kind of where I came on the scene. My father was not only the oldest dad on the block, he was older than all of my friends' grandfathers. It was quite the talk of our little town, of our little block in Long Beach, New York.
Right. Wow. So were you the youngest? Were there any after you?
No, none after me. I'm the end of the line.
Awesome. Yeah, that's just like me. I think the youngest sibling gets the best deal, honestly. But so you said your father had been blind for several years by the time that you were born. Did that have an influence on you growing up, being in such close proximity with someone with a disability like that? Did it teach you a little bit more about working with people that have non-traditional circumstances in their lives?
Well, absolutely. Actually, starting at age about 8 or 9, I started a regiment of working for my father as his reader. He was a voracious reader when he had his sight, very interested in all things current events, all things politics, all things public policy. Again, this was right at the end of the 1950s, early 1960s. He was fascinated by the Southern Civil Rights Movement. So I would read newspaper columns to him. He called them the opinions. And I didn't, understand all that I was reading, but I helped along his ability. Of course, he listened to the radio a lot and got his news from real reporters. And also he would host, not every week, but a couple of times a month, some of his old buddies from New York. They would take the Long Island Railroad and visit our home, and they would have these discussions, mostly argumentative discussions about the issues of the day. I would be, a child listening to the passion, listening to these very, very passionate conversations about what could be done and should be done. And I really distinctly recall one of the subjects of most of their conversation was about civil rights and the harsh treatment of the Blacks, African Americans in the South. It was fascinating, and I know why they were interested in that. They were all immigrants, peers of my father, and frankly, while they were discriminated against, in some ways, if they had money in their pocket, they could eat at any restaurant they wanted in New York. They could have friendships, go to the theater. He loved Joe Louis, the boxer, and they would go to boxing matches. And there was never a question that African Americans and whites could socialize in that way if they wished to. So it really astonished them the more they learned about the vicious discrimination, the lynchings, the inability to hold a job or keep a job. They got very, very involved. My father's interest was in the Freedom Riders. These were the mostly young people, college age, who would bust down to the South for voter registration. And of course, that history is well known. What may not be well known is some of their most ardent supporters were immigrant Jews from what they called the old country, who started to spark and have an interest in helping this movement of young people. And again, I was immersed as a young teenager in those conversations, mostly as a listener. I didn't start speaking quite yet about the subjects, but I absorbed a whole lot of them. I was in my father's room when Dr. King delivered his speech in 1963, the "I Have a Dream" speech, and I write about that and my recollection of the emotions that went into him feeling the sense of pride that we are going to make progress. That was very, very real.
Well, the empathy that comes from him, it seems very natural, because there must have been some sort of similarity between the pogroms that he suffered and these anti-Black massacres that you've seen in the South, especially related to election attempts. We've had several, a Ocoee massacre here, a Rosewood, things like that. So I'm sure that there was some empathy just from his own background.
Well, there's no doubt in my mind that there was this sense of a brotherhood, sense of being in a situation of having someone rule over you, of having no voice. When Tsar Nicholas launched the pogroms and had the Cossacks come and ravage these towns, that was the kind of subjugation that we only have nightmares about, and it was very real to them, and they knew about this. They suffered it. They escaped with their lives, and again, just a few decades later, there was World War II, in which the decimation of the European Jews were pretty much the big motivator for Adolf Hitler's horrible Reich. And while none of my father's friends were directly involved in that, the word got out, and I'm pretty sure that a good reason why in the 1960s they got very interested in the civil rights movement were all fed by that revulsion to autocracy, to horrible treatment of their fellow human beings. And this was very, very real and very, very present, not only in their conversation, but in their support, in their philanthropy.
I know a lot of American Jews who had immigrated, especially ones in New York, sort of formed coalitions to try and help and advocate for allowing America and other countries to accept refugees from Europe. Is that anything that your dad was involved in, or did he know anything about those efforts?
Well, he was very involved in the support for the Abraham Lincoln Brigade in the 1930s. This was the American mercenary force that went to battle Francisco Franco in the Spanish Civil War. That was basically a 3-year mission, and many of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade members had been actually World War I veterans. And years later, they put on a uniform. They were paid. Again, they were mercenaries, but the private funding of that was something that my father, again, was quite involved with. There were rallies all through the New York metro area. And that's another chapter of his passion for being anti-fascist and creating a conversation that needed to happen. World War II was really a series of events, and one of them, was the Spanish Civil War, during which Hitler's Luftwaffe were training to be bombers. The famous painting by Picasso, Guernica, is actually the bombing of the town of Guernica by German aircraft. And again, that is a symbol of how some movements become not only violent, but they could, decimate a people. And World War II was predated by Mussolini going into Ethiopia and Hitler helping Francisco Franco in Spain.
Right. So it all connected and just sort of had this tumbling snowball effect of building up into this huge thing. And I think there was a lot of realization, like you were saying earlier, after the Holocaust in the United States, of the effects of racial discrimination or ethnic, discrimination based on ethnicity. And I think that led to a lot of the ball rolling on the civil rights movement. Did you remember your dad talking about the war in Vietnam? Because that was going on during that time also.
Oh, yes, very much so. I was graduated from high school in 1968, and
Wow.
that was the year of the big draft call-up with Lyndon Johnson. That was the year of the Democratic National Convention and those riots. I was, I think, not permitted to participate in any of the out-of-town events, but throughout the cycle of the 1960s, there were, many of us who, were kind of practicing activism. We were interested in certain elections. Our congressman, our hometown congressman, was very involved in the anti-war movement. So, we were immersed in that conversation. And when I went to Hunter College, I immediately joined the newspaper, was writing columns, was attending events and reporting them back to our student body. New York was one of the hotbeds of this conversation, Columbia University especially, and where we printed our newspaper, which was called the Hunter Arrow. That's also where The Spectator, which was a fabulous School of Journalism project at Columbia, was printed. So we got to know those guys and women who were writing opinion pieces about the war, about civil rights, the kinds of things that really were very 60s topics. Of course, in 1970 was the Kent State massacre of students who were protesting. And here again, you can participate and you can be an observer. And what I felt was my calling was to do, writing and to some degree speaking about this. I was a school teacher in the East Bronx. My first really professional job was, in a very, very mixed racial neighborhood of Puerto Ricans and Blacks particularly. And, I was one of the teacher activists to try to bring reforms and be able to visit their homes, which were prohibited by the union contract, and to help them with learning English, but also being able to excel, which was their parents' dream. Very, very important formative years between graduating from college in 1972 and teaching for a couple of years.
Right. So you graduated from Hunter's College. You didn't go to graduate school, and you started teaching at what grade level were you teaching?
We called it junior high. It would be equivalent to middle school. So these were basically 13, 14, and 15-year-olds, primarily Puerto Rican in that neighborhood, many African Americans, very few Anglos or whites. And we had a team of teachers who were all trained to work with those minority populations. Our Hunter College had a completely free ride for anyone who wanted to teach in those neighborhoods. So I actually started teaching even before my graduation from college, and then stayed for another 2 years. But my summer job was working in youth camps, but also I started to be a hotel waiter. And I actually ended up for 4 years being an itinerant hotel waiter in New York in the summer on the beach and Miami Beach in the winter. So that was kind of my transition from being a school teacher to being somebody who would work for tips. And that paved the way for later adventures, including graduate school at Purdue University in Indiana for child development. Always fascinated by children, always fascinated by child development. I think that may have been because there were some families on our block who had children who had special needs. I think I equated that with my father's disability, but also I have a full brother who got married and had 3 children, and I helped with their upbringing back in the 1960s. Sorry to be so back and forth in terms of the time frames, but those are exciting times that I'm bringing back right now. And Purdue University was a great research university on child development, and that's also where I met my wife to be. And we've been together now for 44 years. So a lot of that is the great story.
Yes, that's a long time. Okay, so I want to backtrack. First, your major for undergraduate was English, correct?
Yes, English literature.
Okay. And then so you went to working with these students in the Bronx, and you said there was a language issue also, that many of them struggled. I'm guessing were speaking Spanish and were trying to learn English. So you helped facilitate that. And then did that experience give you the motivation to go on to graduate school at Purdue?
Not directly. See, the teachers in this junior high school, there were really 2 classes of teachers, groups of teachers. There were the old teachers. I mean, they were like 40 years old. We couldn't even believe they were still walking and talking. And then there was a group of us, about 6 or 7 of us, who were the young teachers. The old teachers called us the long hairs. Most of us had flowing hair at that time. The guys.
That was the period.
Yeah, that was the period. And we were actually, we were motivated to organize. This is real important in my formative years as an advocate, because again, we were not permitted to meet with the families of these children. It was against the rules, and we found out why. Most of the experienced teachers did not live anywhere near this school. They lived out in the suburbs of Long Island and Westchester. So they arrived the minute the bell rang in the morning, and they left the minute the bell rang in the afternoon. They were not interested in the community. They were not interested in the family. So they had it written into their union contract, a prohibition against working with the parents. We thought that was horrible. We thought that was offensive, and it was ineffective. They pretty much, I don't want to call it a racist attitude. It was just an it was a classist attitude. So we organized, and we basically threatened to go to the school board of New York. Their offices were down in Brooklyn. And we said, we're going to, make this claim that we are prohibited from doing our jobs. Our principal, was also more of, literally the old-fashioned kind of guy. I remember his opening speech when he came to work at our school. He said, 3 blocks from here is the Bronx Zoo, but in this neighborhood, there are animals on both sides of the cages. And again, he was talking about the parents, the families of our kids. It was a horrible time for this division. So a lot of the seeds of my later advocacy and I guess you could call it activism were really planted by that kind of attitude and that kind of negativity. And again, in recollection, 60 years later or 55 years later, it really was up to us to either accept those restrictions and those discriminations or do something about it. And we did something about it. We actually formed a school within a school. We took some of the what were considered to be misbehaving young people. Again, we're talking about very young teenagers, and we created our own curriculum. As a matter of fact, the curriculum for the springtime was baseball, And we had a math teacher teaching how to calculate batting averages. We had a history teacher talking about Jackie Robinson and the civil rights movement. As the English teacher, they had to recite Casey at the Bat and other literature. There was a teacher interested in science, and there was a physics to baseball. We even got our kids peanut vendor jobs. Yankee Stadium was only 4 subway stations away from our school. So we were really active at it, and we created a Summer Olympics program for a while. And again, here becomes this, if we have a problem, we could either accept it or try to solve it. And we did the latter.
That's awesome, because a lot of people, they see this as a starting job and they say, well, I don't like it here. I'm just going to move somewhere else where the kids are nicer. And instead of accepting and seeing that these kids have this particular need and they do have so much potential within them, it just takes the right person and the right programs to bring that out. So I think that's just incredible. Did you, I thought I misheard you earlier, actually, when you were talking about that policy, because it seemed so illogical. So did you also say that you weren't allowed to help them learn English? Okay, yeah, I did. That didn't even make sense to me. So I thought.
Yeah, no, it wasn't that we weren't allowed to help. I mean, my job was to teach them English.
Sure, right.
But we were not allowed to communicate with their parents. In other words, if the parent wanted to meet with us, these parents work 2 jobs. They were not going to show up, during our, lunch hour midweek.
Right.
So, we were not allowed to host them for after hours meetings.
Wow. So it's like there were teachers at this school, the old regime, that didn't really want to put in the extra effort. So they actually banned it so that they wouldn't look bad.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes, it was a one of the clauses in our contract, and we broke the contract because, again, when we started this school within a school, one of the agreements was that we would in fact be able to work with the parents. It was we wanted to make change. I mean, we were 21 years old. I mean, change was part of the environment that we grew up in. Change was part of the protest movement. And this was our little venture into it.
Wow. I just think that's awesome. And so this was how you learned that it can be effective. Did you see any changes in the student body after you did those programs? Were there behavioral improvements?
Absolutely. Our kids did great. They were rewarded by putting in the extra effort. I'll never forget, we did have this one gathering of the parents one evening. This is one of my favorite anecdotes. And this one gentleman, a Puerto Rican dad, came up to me and he says, Mr. Levine, are you the one who is teaching Edgar Allan Poe? And I said, yes, he's one of the poets that we teach, the stories of Edgar Allan Poe. He says, well, my son, he was very interested in this one story. It's a story about a murder. I said, oh, yes, that's The Telltale Heart. He says, yes, and my son was very interested. He said, Papa, the telltale heart beats in Spanish, not only English. And that phrase, that there's a universality to the lesson. The lesson of the story, of course, is that, the murderer ended up confessing because the heart of his victim came back to life. That was how he imagined it. And the whole idea of a criminal act haunting the perpetrator, but the idea that the father said the telltale heart beats in Spanish, not only English, was very memorable. And I think about that conversation almost as an example of this intercultural attitude that we kept very close to our hearts in those 2 years in the Bronx.
Wow. So you said that you were doing summer jobs working in Miami. Is that how you came to become a Floridian?
Well, not directly. The hotel waiting profession was picked up. Actually, all of the young teachers were fired. I probably forgot to say that.
Oh, oh.
Yeah, there were tremendous budget cuts, and the old phrase is the last hired, the first fired. So in 1974. After 2 years of teaching, we had to go actually find a different job. We weren't going to be hired. And it was that same summer of 74 when I worked at this very elegant beachside hotel, only about a half a mile from where I grew up, called the Lido Beach Hotel. And I fell into it, but I liked it a lot. I liked the people. They were all old. They were my father's contemporaries. They were actually all from New York. They came for the entire summer. We opened basically officially in June, and we worked through Labor Day. It was a summer resort hotel, and picked up not only great relationships and very good tips, but one of my guests owned a hotel in Miami Beach. And after I told him that his name was Mr. Schechter, I told him that, the young teachers were fired. I'm not really sure what I was going to be doing this winter. He said, well, I know what you're going to be doing. You're going to come and work for me at my hotel. So I ended up doing that for 3 winters, 4 summers and 3 winters. So that was kind of like this hiatus. And I only really worked 5 months a year and traveled the rest of the time.
Oh, what kind of places were you visiting?
Well, on the road, I stayed in the United States, visited out west. I had a brother who lived in Arizona, and we had some family friends in California. So mostly out west, just kind of making our way, not too much up north, but just kind of found our way to make new friendships.
That's a beautiful area of the country. I love the Southwest. I'm very infamous for taking road trips out there. So, but Florida was where you ended up. But was it this job that sort of introduced you to Florida and you liked it? Had you been to Florida before? Why? What was the ultimate?
No, that was just happenstance. So, I knew I wanted to go to graduate school. I applied to graduate school and got admitted, and got an assistantship in 1976. And very early, really in the first week, I met this wonderful woman, and she herself had been there a year already. And we got very close very fast. When I drove from New York to Indiana, I had never been to Pennsylvania. Well, I was in Philadelphia maybe once, but I'd never been to Ohio. I'd never been to Indiana. I'd never been to the Midwest. So this was, quite an adventure. There's an old New York cartoonist named Steinberg who did this fabulous poster about the New Yorker's view of the world. And that was kind of me. I didn't know the difference between Illinois and Indiana. And then there was another I called Iowa. And the funny thing about it is that was kind of me. I just had no experience in those parts of the country. But Purdue was a very good place to be for 2 years. Met some wonderful folks, got some very good education, I think, about child development. And then after I finished, my sweetheart wanted to get another degree, and she applied to several graduate schools, but Florida State University was her best deal. And I decided to come along. So that was 1978.
Okay, so you moved to Tallahassee in 1978. And
Yes.
what was she studying for this new degree?
Social work.
Okay, so you guys have a similar interest base. Yeah, you met in class, right?
Yes, we met in class. Actually, I had to find out through an intermediary what her class schedule is, so I could kind of show up and get to know her that way.
Put the moves on.
Yeah, yeah. I don't need to go much further down that road, but The move to Tallahassee really was eye-opening. Again, a New Yorker coming to a small southern town, even though I knew, of course, it was the state capital, I really had no grasp of what the differences would be. She was immersed in school, and I, did not really have a job. And very, very quickly, she introduced me to one of her classmates who knew of a teaching opening that had just happened at one of the delinquency residential centers in Tallahassee. It was called a START Center. It was an acronym, short-term student something. Anyway, and that was my exposure to the Florida juvenile justice system as a 27-year-old. And if you want to transition into that part of the conversation, that's where I think you reached out to me because of that experience I had and that knowledge that I gained very, very quickly in Florida.
Yes, absolutely. So you were working at this center in Tallahassee. Was it like a school where the students went during the daytime and went home to their families at night, or was it sort of like Dozier in that they kept people there? Did they?
Well, it was right in the middle of that, Abby. They were sentenced there, and they came from all over the state. It wasn't a lot of students. There were about 30 in total, and they were there for anywhere from 3 to 4 months to like 6 to 7 months, all age 15 and 16. And what astonished me was one of the first things they would say to me, almost by clockwork, is, we got introduced, because they would come at different parts of the year. It wasn't like only for the school year, because they lived there, throughout the months. One of the first things almost every boy said to me was, "Do not send me, Mr. Jack," they called me, "don't send me to Dozier." And I didn't know what they were talking about. I didn't know what that meant. So I'm a curious guy, of course. So after hearing that maybe 5 times, I asked my superintendent, the guy who ran the place, who is or what is Dozier? And he looks at me and he says, "Why do you ask?" And I said, "Well, because every kid that I meet, that's one of the first things they tell me is not to send them there." So I got a real half-hearted answer from him. It's kind of none of your business, but it was my business. Well, Charlotte had to get a car. We had to get a car for her to do her internship. So I got very curious about this place in Mariana called the Dozier School. It was 50 miles west, a time zone west. And I just decided one day, because I had found out that the superintendent took an annual vacation, and he'd be, this is pre-cell phone days, he would be off campus. And I did some research. So I showed up and made my way onto the campus. There were about 900 boys confined there. They called it a training school, but it was really a prison for teenagers. It was an institution. And I was also told, again, through the grapevine, that they had what they called the lockup. So that was my intention. I needed to see what the boys that I knew were so afraid of. And what they were afraid of, and some of them had cousins and other kids from their neighborhood who were sent there, was a brutal setting. I went on campus. It was a weekend afternoon. I had my ID because we worked for the same Department of Health and Rehabilitative Services. I talked my way in. I went to the lockup. The guard there opened the door and, "What are you doing here?" He asked me, and I said, "Oh, I'm here on a visit just to find some information about, what I'm doing in Tallahassee." And I was very, very evasive. And I finally convinced him to come and come up this long hallway and open a door. And it was hot. It was horribly smelly, kind of a combination of, sweat and urine. It was disgusting. And the door, it was even hard to open the door because there was this bolt lock. And that scared me because I'm thinking, if it's hard to open the door, what happens if there's a problem? I mean, your mind races. I'm 28 years old. I'm trying to figure this out. And he actually went back to his station and picked up a book and brought it back. I was observing all this, of course, and he whacked the slip lock with the book. The book happened to have been the Holy Bible. It was a large edition. And that to me was like this huge irony that was what it was used. And he opens the door and there's this very, very thin child, looked to me like 12 years old, maybe 13, with just like pajama pants, no shirt, no mattress. It was a concrete slab. And this was my first exposure to any kind of horrific maltreatment anywhere. I never observed child abuse. I never observed somebody in that kind of condition. I talked to this boy. One of the first things that came to my mind is I said, I'm not sure I can help you, but I know I can't hurt you. And the guard was watching this whole conversation. And finally, I noticed that he had these red marks around his wrists. And then I noticed he also had red marks around his ankles. And I asked him what happened. And he gave this kind of frightful look, and he looked right at the guard. And the guard said, well, he was doing the wrong thing. As a matter of fact, he was throwing the food back at us. And he mentioned some other things that this little skinny guy was doing. And the kid said, why don't you tell him why I did it? And the guy did not answer, but I asked him, why were you so misbehaving? And he says, the boys in the cottage were doing me. And then I later learned doing him was basically sex abuse. And he said they were using the handles of brooms to violate them. Now, again, I'm thinking that I don't know what to do with this information. I almost was second guessing myself of why I was even there. It was my curiosity and my hearing about the fear that the boys I knew at my school did not want to go there. So I was only inside that lockup for about 20, 25 minutes. It was time for me to go because I have a feeling the guard was getting very uncomfortable with what I was hearing and what I was seeing. And I kind of thought it's time to kind of get in my car. And, really, I was literally shaking with fear. Not fear about myself, but fear of what I saw and what else was going on. Again, there were 900 boys within the confines of this 5-7 acre place. And I came back to Tallahassee. I don't think I told my sweetheart at the time what I saw, but the next day I went to my superintendent. I was, back at school, and I told him where I went this weekend to the Dozier School, and he just gave me this look like, what were you doing there? And I said, well, I was curious, and I saw child abuse there, so I need to know how to report it. And he goes, well, what do you mean, how to report it? And I said, well, I'm reporting it to you. But, I don't know any other people in this department outside of this school. So I had to ask around, and I just found some people who would listen to me, although it was a 3-month period before I kind of broke through and got one of my superiors to actually do a site visit. By the time we got out there, things had changed. Not for the better necessarily, but they were masking what I had seen. There was this disinfectant smell. Instead of 18 boys in lockup, there was nobody there. They were basically treating me as if I had imagined this. Mm. It was really this hidden secret. Well, shortly after that, there was a conference, kind of a training conference that I was eligible to attend. And one of the trainers was a public defender from Jacksonville. Her name is Claudia Wright, and there was something about the way she spoke about the system that really attracted me. We had a break, and I asked her if she had ever been out to the Dozier School, and she said no, she's never been there. She's had some of her clients who were sent there. And I said, well, Claudia, I really want to talk to you about what I observed and the reaction. And she said, well, this is not exactly in her purview, but she said there's a brand new rights law firm, private, that is being established in Gainesville. It's run by a man named Al Hadid, and it's called Southern Legal Counsel, which still exists. And she said he may be interested in your story. And that's kind of how the whole attention to Dozier was birthed in 1979. Claudia ended up going out there. I went with her at one time. We kind of snuck our way in, and she observed some abuses. And we fed that information to Al Hadid. And the lawsuit that was filed, the Bobby M. versus Governor Graham, was a class action federal lawsuit that is very well documented. And we can fast forward 5, 10, 15 years, and it really was not until 2018 that the Dozier School was finally closed. There were still 100 boys out there when they finally closed it.
So I want to backtrack a little bit. Do you remember what Claudia saw when she went to the school?
Well, we were not permitted to go into the lockup. We were in the superintendent's office, and obviously he was his name was Lennox Williams. He went by the name Link Williams. He was not at all happy about us coming on campus. He had several staff members with him, but she point blank asked about that practice of handcuffing and it was called hog tying. And my best recollection is, he denied it. He said that's the kind of thing we used to do. And we really did not have a direct agenda. We weren't there to release kids. We were there basically to just intervene, knocking on the door and trying to get some more information about what was going on there. It was probably a dangerous thing to do professionally for her, but she was very, very committed. And I was still under employ. So, I resigned pretty close after that because, I joined this rights organization called the Florida Center for Children and Youth. But the answer is some of it's kind of cloudy. In other words, the whole sequence of what we were doing at Lennox Williams' table was kind of unusual and probably quite courageous. He's now deceased. He had this eye issue. He could sit in the middle of a conference table. I observed this. And he could sit a boy far to his left, let's just say 7 feet to his left, and another boy far to his right. And this was one of his techniques of controlling kids. And he could literally look at both boys at the same time because he had this eye problem, muscular eye problem. And again, that was just to me, a glimpse of the unusualness of this environment. And he was frightful. I mean, he dipped and the juice would come out of his mouth onto his shirt. And it's like he didn't mind that. It's in other words, it's kind of like the call central casting and find somebody who had a set of kind of disgusting traits, and he ran the place.
And you can imagine to children that just sort of adds to the element of terror that you have
Yeah.
this person. So you knew when you arrived at the school, you called it the lockup. I've heard it called ice cream factory, the White House, all these different names depending on the time period. But you had heard about that building specifically from your students.
No,
What
this
have you heard?
this is a different building than the White House.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so the White House era preceded that. I mean, I have no evidence that when I was there in 1978, that they were, whipping the kids with leather straps, murdering the kids. This all preceded my visit.
Right. That was because the governor visited in 68 or 69, and then they banned corporal punishment, but they were still using solitary confinement, which is what you witnessed, but it's in a different building.
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. And again, the clarity is the environment of an institution, especially an institution that is a big employer in a small town. There is within it a pattern of neglect. Again, this is 50 miles from the state capitol.
Mm-hmm.
This is under an administration, when I was there, of supposed reformers, Bob Graham. And I came to later really appreciate the tension that was evoked when the federal lawsuit was filed, because frankly, nothing was going to be done otherwise, even though there was evidence that there was a problem. So again, I'm not pointing an accusatory finger at any one public official, but the reality is that that the economics of running a major institution and being in a major employer has its own isolation. I mean, again, another deceased person who basically protected all of the North Florida institutions, Senator Dempsey Barron, he was very, very close to the hierarchy of these institutions. I mean, this was a system of mutuality of employment, and it turns out to be, destructive actions. But this needed to be changed, and it took quite a while to do it.
So do you think that the sort of isolated location of this school and the isolated population that it employed contributed pretty significantly to it taking over 100 years for the school to finally be shut down in spite of abuses from day one?
Yes, and the youth institutions weren't the only institutions. I mean, there were also developmental disabilities institutions, state hospitals, again, with various levels of concern by people who were not within those walls, within those fences. But institutionalization as a method of service was very, very prevalent, especially, where, we had the prison belt, and we still do have the prison belt. So we had the institution belt of these other institutions. And I give you all that from a very narrow perspective of this, one young teacher who observed really one set of incidents that created a wow, this is really happening, not in fiction, but in fact. Mm-hmm. And I think the important thing about all this conversation about what, ended up resulting is it became politically untenable to keep that institution open. I mean, it was operating when it finally closed. It was operating at a $10 million budget for 100 kids. Right. That's $100,000 a head.
Mm-hmm. And that's the reason that they cited for closing it. They didn't technically say that they were closing it because of these abuses. It was because of of a larger effort, at least nominally, because of a larger effort to defund this monster of a juvenile justice and general justice system and incarceration system in Florida, and that we were spending so much money. So it was sort of, I could be reading this wrong, but part of a bigger shift away from mass incarceration in this state.
Well, the only correction I'd make to that from, again, my individual perception, because again, I had already become a, pretty much full-fledged child advocate at the time, was it took leadership, and the leadership that made the institution called the Dozier School close was really reposited in a very, very fine public servant named Wansley Walters. She had done some very, very good work in Miami. She happened to have been appointed to the newly elected Governor Rick Scott's transition team. She put together a 300-page report on different matters of juvenile justice, but she learned very, very quickly, because she knew of kids who had gone to Dozier, of course, from Miami. And I would credit her individually with convincing the governor that there was a fiscal reason, because I think that's what he wanted to attend to. But I really do believe, knowing Wansley as I do, that there was a passion for justice that was one of the great underlying motivators for her.
Do you know how she got involved in the entire thing?
Well, she was appointed after writing a 300-page document for the newly elected governor. She thought she was just going to continue her job in Miami, and his advisor said, "You can't let this one go. You've got to hire her." She became Secretary of Juvenile Justice under his administration. Wow. Yeah, she became his Secretary of Juvenile Justice for 3 years and was succeeded by somebody she mentored named Christy Daly. Now she's Christy Boudour. But anyway, yeah, this was a reformer within the Scott administration.
So what about
she'd be a great interview for you.
Oh, I was planning on after we formally close, I'm definitely going to ask you for her contact information, because I'm very interested. I'm a little embarrassed to admit, I don't think her name is ringing any bells for me. So if she really did play as important of a part as you're saying, I want to know more about it, because I've totally missed that piece of the story, it seems like.
And also Al Hadid is still around. He is the county attorney for Flagler County. He lives in Flagler County, and he was the chief litigant. He's the one who got U.S. Judge Maurice Paul to put very, very heavy constraints on the operation of the Dozier School. Yeah, these characters are still walking and talking.
Right. Yes, that's I wanted to do an oral history based project. So that was why I picked Dozier, other than that I grew up pretty close to the area, was that I wanted something that there were still people like yourself who could bear witness to. Speaking of, I wanted to ask you one other question. I remember when I read about your account, or not about others' accounts of your visit to the school, I heard that you saw boys whose heads were shaved because they had been pulling their hair out. Could you tell me a little about that?
Yeah, well, that same boy that I described with the pajama bottoms, he had a shaved head. Mm-hmm. And again, when I asked him, what that was about, that's when he told me about, being that the other boys, again, his phrase was doing him. So, mm-hmm. I mean, this was obviously a reaction, and he was pulling his hair out.
Right.
And I guess to solve that problem, they shaved his head. But I don't know how many other kids' heads were shaved. Again, I had a very limited exposure to the other kids.
Sure. Well, I'm sure it took probably everything that was in you not to just turn around and run as far as you could from that place. And I think it's also interesting that you mentioned all the difficulty in opening the door, because we were just talking about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. And there was also the incident, I don't know if you know about this, earlier in the school's history, where I can't remember if it was 1912 or 1914, but there was a fire at the school where the fire escapes were locked, and a similar, the scenario played out as it does when you're in that situation, and there were several students who died. So it's interesting that they seem to have still not really learned that lesson by the time you were there, as far as, not having people in a situation that they can't escape from. I wanted to ask, why, in your personal opinion, do you think the conditions were so bad? Was it inadequate training of the staff and in this isolated environment? Was it overcrowding? What are your theories?
Well, not being a psychologist, but being a person who, again, I saw for two people throughout my childhood. So I'm an observer. And what I think happens in a situation like incarceration is, number one, clearly 80% of those kids should not have been there because there was no alternatives. Over the decades, judges had a decision to make what to do with kids who, were trespassers or broke into, somebody's house. I mean, we're not talking about, a whole flock of 900 murderers here. We're talking about a diversity of crimes. And I think one reason an institution thrives on a control mechanism is the basic justice that should have been afforded these kids within a parental structure, within a court system that would work well. Those kids, they came either consciously or even unconsciously knowing that they shouldn't be there. Mm-hmm. And when you're in a situation like that, you don't comply. You find a way of rebelling. Then there's the whole issue of adolescent psychology. I mean, the strong prey upon the weak. And when you have that situation, there is really a hierarchy of violence that, again, in some ways feeds the capacity of adults, who are the ultimate arbiters of all this, to not have to deal with the kids too directly because there are enforcers. Mm-hmm. So, you have these 16, 17, 18-year-olds preying on the 12, 13, 14-year-olds. So that just kind of becomes this overall, it creates this anger that really doesn't end. I mean, the food's not good. There's no luxury. There is a complete separation from all things that have to do with anything to do with warmth and love and caring. Add all that up, and you have an institutional mindset, which is getting by, getting your paycheck. I'm not here necessarily to help. I'm here to incarcerate.
Sort of like the other school teachers you worked with in New York, where they're just clocking in, clocking out.
Yeah. In other words, after a while, maybe you intended to do the right thing in the beginning, but after a while, it kind of wears you down. And, you kind of wonder, is this the best I can do? And frankly, for a lot of these employees, given the circumstances of the economy, that's kind of the best they can do. And again, I don't want to disparage it, but there's also this overlay of race. Yeah. There's a higher proportion, as the decades went by, of more kids not having an alternative where they grew up and they happen to be Black. And again, the entire region of North Florida, was much more harsh to the issue of segregation, and that's a factor. The complication, though, is at what point does the isolation, the razor wire, the locked doors, at what point does that really become a such a normal way of doing business that that nobody has an interest in upsetting the status quo? And I think that's precisely where we were, in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and a good part of the 70s is, the judges who sent them there were not going to take this kid home. The community who, relied on the paychecks to go to the grocery store and, even support the church, we're not going to say we're doing the wrong thing. And the admission of that is a very, very hard thing. I mean, there's lots of examples of this happening. We know there have been, places where we've been sending girls and boys, to give them religious training, and actually that religious training has been abuse. But if you can interpret your beliefs based upon this is a saving activity, then you kind of adapt to it. It's hard to admit mistakes. And it's hard to admit mistakes that are 100 years old.
So you would say that they sort of, at least some of the staff members might have demonized the children a little bit in their own minds to sort of justify the treatment that they were given?
Yeah, I mean, the attitude that you did something wrong, whatever that is, and maybe even as how minor it is, so it is your fault for being here. Don't pass that on to me. I'm here to make sure that you don't leave this place. And again, there's a logic to it. I mean, you are one of the pieces of the puzzle that come together. That's called institutionalization. And you are part of that picture. And you may feel in some ways that you are as captive as the kids, because you might feel you don't have an alternative either.
There definitely weren't a lot of jobs in that area outside of the justice system that offered benefits and healthcare and things like that to employees. So it was sort of a difficult situation there locally. And I think that there was sort of an animosity that emerged locally after, maybe, I'm not sure what it was like after Bobby M. Maybe you could tell me a little bit about that, but I know certainly after the more recent exposés were published, there was a lot of backlash locally where people were really defending the school and its mission. And they truly believed that these were the worst of the worst, and that the employees there were doing everything they could to try and control these children. So,
that's so accurate. Again, the overlay of culture is, what do we practice? I've only partially been exposed to that in several different venues over my lifetime, but it becomes it's a way of being. It's really not even conscious. I don't believe it to be conscious. When you hear that a federal lawsuit is filed, that the judges are going to put decrees, that, newspaper reporters are snooping around, again, a lot of that kind of feeds this sense that you've got something to protect and preserve, that you've grown up with, that you have been shown to be, in some ways, the way we do business here. So, I mean, there's a sense to it that you want to reject any kind of change or anything that smacks of reform. And this is not unusual to, youth incarceration, but it becomes all the more, I think, horrific because there's a certain innocence to some of these kids. They not only had a bad night, they had a bad life. I mean, kids don't wake up at 14 years old and decide to be, criminals.
Right. To go steal a car. Or,
yeah.
right.
Yeah. There's an escalation of circumstances. I never excused it, but I can explain it.
Right. And right. Those aren't the same things, but we also, I think we have to remember these are children and that they're not the only, they're very impressionable, and there's a lot of influences that are disproportionately acting on these children, than they would for an adult. And I think that sort of ties into what you're doing now with Four Generations. I do want to get back to I don't want to skip to the end yet, but I do think it's worth noting, because when children are incarcerated, they're separated. That link between them and their family members is lost, and they don't have that influence anymore. So did that sort of influence your focus on the whole family and holistic advocacy?
Well, yes. What started to happen probably about 15 years ago was, as much as I loved the membership of the organization that I headed for 25 years and developed these wonderful friendships and collegial networking relationships, there seemed to be a singularity to the conversation, which is kids, 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 children, children, children. So my diversification into multi-generational work, it's not a U-turn, it's just an expansion of the lanes. I have no regrets about the focus on young people. We've done some amazing things, policy and program in Florida, from, Healthy Start for pregnant women all the way through a whole array of positive reforms. Big attention now on early learning, lots going on in that arena. But I realized that, just like the billboard said, come and enjoy your retirement, and it's like this idyllic, golf course scene or swaying palms and, 55 and over. There started to be in my mind, because I grew up with old people. I mean, I was immersed in old immigrants. That was my childhood. And I started realizing that Florida had become this segregation of ages place. And I don't think it intended to be, but it's how it was sold. Mm-hmm. And the older people that I was talking to, many of them were guardians ad litem and representing kids in the court system or volunteering at their, places of worship. And they wanted to connect with kids. They were satisfied, if it wasn't their own grandchildren, to maybe help somebody else's grandchild. And I realized that our state government was actually feeding the problem of segregation by having all of these different departments competing for the same attention and the same dollar. Mm-hmm. We had to realize that, we had the Department of Children and Families, Department of Health, Department of Juvenile Justice, Department of Elder Affairs, and nobody was talking about family as a unit. Nobody was talking about the advanced age that we are living at. I mean, again, when I was growing up in the 1950s, 60 was old. We have added almost 30 years to the life cycle in this past century. We've almost doubled life expectancy. So, the whole idea of the vision for Four Generations Institute is a vision of reality. We are now fully four generations. And there are these 50 to 75-year-olds plus who have a life experience that they may want to share. And they may want to invest that life experience as a symbol of legacy. And then, of course, 3 years and 3 months ago, my wife and I became grandparents. And oh my gosh, I had been warned that, I'd be one heck of a grandfather. It's like my buddies, would call me up and say, Jack, wait till you become a grand. And I would say, yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, but it's been amazingly life-changing. The thoughts, the interaction, and even though they live in a completely other part of the country, we're so present with them. Now, I give you all that because Florida has a long way to grow when it comes to the respect of the generations. Young people need to learn how to respect elders, and elders need to learn how to respect young people. And I think the curriculum of caring that would be necessary to do that is still more aspirational than real. And I'm at it. Really, literally, a day does not go by when I am not preaching the gospel of intergeneration to some audience when I was allowed to be in the same room as people, and now with writing and promoting intergenerational work. It's my big deal, and I'm getting more interest in the last 5 to 10 years than I ever imagined.
I think that's such an important issue that we've sort of forgotten about as a society. Is like we had this animosity now almost between like the boomer generation and the millennial generation, where people are just having a hard time seeing eye to eye because society has simply changed so much in the last 50 or 60 years. And I think that it's sort of turned into this blame game almost of who's responsible for today's issues, when really we should be working together and seeing how we can combine our minds and our philosophies and find something that works for everyone.
That's so true, Abby. Again, one of my catchphrases is age is an attitude. I know some very young 90-year-olds and I know some very old 20-year-olds. Because if you think you kind of know it all, maybe because of a device that knows it all and you know how to get into that device, that doesn't necessarily mean that you understand it. And if you are in your 80s or 90s, and you get up every morning, how can I contribute to this community? How can I use my resources of time and dollars and energy on behalf? That makes you very young. That is a trend that I think we could absolutely build upon. And again, I'm not making this up. I see it. I see it very, very well. And when I'm in front of a college classroom and I realize that, these are, the potential is so great, and yet very few are reading for pleasure. And I'm thinking, well, you know how to read. You're not reading for, no, I only read when I have to. And I'm thinking, really? I mean, gosh, I mean, no literature at all? It's kind of like.
Right. It's really unfortunate. There's like a disconnect that's evolving.
Yeah, and I'm not holding myself up as some great paragon, but my gosh, I mean, I think there's something to be said about, respecting that there are some amazing life lessons in some amazing literature.
Must be the English major in you.
Yeah, I guess so. I know so.
Yes. Well, I for one definitely do love a good book, but I know that it's a huge issue now with just easier media, more accessible media, more mindless type things that are available. So it makes it easier to sort of put off the mental exertion of reading a book. But there's definitely still value there. And I think that's why it's so important for us to be connecting with older people so that we can understand and get those lessons. And I hadn't thought about it, but you're right. Like in Florida, we do have all these, like my stepsister's grandparents just moved to a retirement community in Tampa, 5 hours or 7 hours away from us. And we don't have that connection with them anymore. But now they're meeting all these other people that are their age and having, these interactions with them. But there's still that, that generational divide. And it's gotten worse with COVID, most certainly.
Yeah, it's magnified the problem, and we're trying to give it solution, but it's a tough haul. And there's one more thing I want to add to that, because you just reminded me of something. I really think we need to figure out what we're addicted to. Usually addiction is thought of as a substance, but I am starting to believe that we are kind of addicted to being spectators. I know guys who could name 100 football players and don't know the name of one of their kids' teachers. I know folks who will watch, an entire series of shows that are, 50 installments, but are not expressing themselves at all, in a handwritten letter or even, emailed letter to somebody. It's almost like watching somebody else do this stuff.
Live their life, right?
Right. And spectatorism has its place, but it should never replace doing and learning and being active. So that's part of my pitch.
There's a Terrence McKenna quote that I actually like a lot, where he's just talking about that we sort of make other people the stars of our own lives, and we sort of see other people as being more important than us when we choose to take time away from our lives. If I'm choosing to read an article about a celebrity on my phone or watch it, whatever, MTV, then I'm taking time to prioritize really their life over my own. And when you start thinking about it that way, you see that we've sort of been taught to see ourselves as side characters in our own life story.
Very, very important. Just go to a youth soccer game, and the parents may be present, but they're online. They're not even watching their child play.
Mm-hmm. Or I see parents that are so busy recording their kids, their babies, like the baby only knows having a camera in its face more than its parents' face. I know it's like they know that every moment is precious. You're only a kid for so long, but I'm like, interact with your child instead of just videotaping them. Like tell them a story, or I don't know. The kid's gonna think the iPhone is its parent. Like.
We laugh, but we're really crying.
I'm not a parent, of course, not by far. And I don't want to like judge or shame other people, but it is an issue that I think we need to address more in our society, especially like these kids that are growing up now. I see their parent just hand their kid an iPad and there's no interaction for the next 45 minutes and they're just clicking away. And I worry. I was at the very tail end of growing up without that kind of thing. There weren't iPhones when I was that age, but I see it a little bit in myself, and I can only wonder what it's going to be like for the generations coming up after me.
Yeah, and I think also the idea of introspecting and thinking about our influences, both positive and negative. There's a situation I think some of us put ourselves in where whatever was. When I have the opportunity, and you can tell, by our conversation today, I try to excavate what those situations were. What were those arguments that my father and his cronies had that that somehow got planted in my brain to know that that was passion. It was not just words, it was passion. And if there's one thing that I'm self-congratulating myself with, is the passion has lived. Whether it be those the stories I hear, the people I meet, the places I go, and all that. And I think we need to mix some passion into some of this, because there's a lot of dispassion out there, and a lot of observation without real involvement.
I think it's hard for people of my generation or anyone living in this current time period, because we just get this constant onslaught of information that really is, especially media and stuff, it's just aimed to grab your attention. And a lot of the time, the easiest way to grab attention is negatively. So we sort of become apathetic, because it's like all we hear is just this endless broken record of bad news, and it makes it very easy to sort of tune out. So I guess what I'm asking is, how have you kept the passion alive? Do you ever just get kind of overwhelmed with the weight of the world's issues and trying to fight them?
No, that's not in my ability to be negative, or even really to be angry. I make a joke of it, but I really feel I take optimism pills every day. And sometimes I'm the only person in the room who is under the influence of optimism. Mm-hmm. But we really can't make progress, in my experience, unless we give folks a sense that they can make a difference, and there are ways of doing it. I mean, getting to the yes is a very, very concentrated way of saying, if I believe these things, I think I need to give it a shot to help you believe them too. And that's kind of the heart of advocacy, but it's also a strategy, because I've never met a person who says, I don't want children to be healthy. I don't want them to be safe. I don't want them to be educated. I don't want them to be crime-free. The basics of what we hope for our own are pretty much universal. It's just a question of how to get there and what role you'll play. So, the sense that I continue to have is, let's make a decision to define and deliberate on what is the right thing. And then if we agree to that, then the rest is kind of details, And I know how almost simplistic that sounds, but it's true. When I think that, the idea of what we've done about tobacco use as an example, and there are, 20 examples I could come up with, but, the idea that it used to be routine to go to meetings and sit in conveyances and be breathing in other people's tobacco smoke. It's like, what? Now it just seems such an anathema.
I know.
But I remember. I mean, there are reforms, and they can be processed. Okay, Abby. So whenever else I get to this point of saying thank you, what else do you need, and what does this become? You go through this amazing editing process. What's going on now?
So right, with this interview, what we would do is it's going to go to our YouTube. Deborah Hendricks is our fantastic technical analyst. So she's going to edit this. They don't trust me with that because that's not my specialty. But yes, she is going to edit it. We also have transcribers. So a transcription of it will be conducted at some point. Sometimes we get a little bit behind on those, so it depends. It does usually. I will probably be the one who ends up transcribing these, so it'll probably get done pretty quickly. But that and the this video and audio of the interview will both be available on, we call it the UFDC, University of Florida Digital Collections, which is on our library website. I will send you how you can get to that, and we'll show you how you can access your interview. But that's the public record. So eventually, once it makes its way through our system and is processed and edited, we'll take that and make it available on the public record so that anybody can see this and watch it and learn from it and use the resource that I'm also getting access to, which is, it's just so incredible that you have a lot of times, we interview someone because of one big historical thing that they've experienced, but your life just ties all these different aspects together, especially your father's life. So that it's just been so awesome to be able to speak with you.
Well, thanks. And you never even got a hint of my maternal grandmother. My God, now is there a story with her?
I did have a question. We just got so carried. I had a question about her way at the beginning, and then we ended up just getting, but we don't have to be done yet. I'm here to talk more. Please tell me about her.
No, not right now. If we want to do a chapter 2, there's this amazing chronicity to my father and my maternal grandmother that is almost astonishing. They were born in the same year. They were born, we calculated, probably only about 60 or 70 miles from each other. Of course, they never met until my father fell in love with her daughter.
In the U.S., in Indiana? Or no.
No. In his shop. My mother worked for my father in his shop, in his business.
Right.
But there was a 25-year age difference. So when my father was invited to meet his sweetheart, my mother's parents, there was this reckoning because they were not only age peers, but they were very different. My mother's parents were very orthodox, and my father was a dyed-in-the-wool agnostic. But my grandmother had this power of feeding people and making them do things that they weren't even knowledgeable they agreed to. She had some kind of a serum that she put into her dinners that you were under her trance. Mm-hmm. She fed you dinner and then you did her bidding.
Right. Very charismatic.
For her own causes. I mean, she was a phenomenal influence on so many people, and I watched her do this. I mean, it's real. There's really a story there, and it's a story and a half.
So she immigrated from Russia as well.
Yeah, only 1 year apart from my dad.
And oh my gosh, I know you said you wouldn't tell me, but could you just tell me a little sneak peek? How did she do that? How did she get to the U.S.?
Well, she was 15. She was 15 going on 16.
Just like your dad.
I know. And four girls, they were a little bit older than her, also left the pogroms. One, I think one of them had already been molested, and they escaped, and again came on the same route to New York, different boat, same era.
Went through Poland.
Yeah, that was the only way out. It was the port of Danzig. Now we call it Gdansk. And but her deal was, she was a suffragist. Her deal was, how come men have all of these rights and all of these opportunities, and we don't, and we even work harder than them. She really was a liber and a pioneer. So yeah, we're going to have to get to her.
Yes, I would love to have. I would love to have another interview with you. Just to,
Right.
I'm so fascinated by the whole dynamic, the lead up to the Bolshevik Revolution and
Yeah.
the global impacts of that. So, but I know that we've already gone for almost 2 hours. So,
Yeah, I mean, the amazing symmetry between those two, my two greatest influences, the amazing symmetry. When I really sit down and figure out the calendar and the connections that have existed without even, you almost can't make it up. It's so connected. Yeah, there's stuff to be said about it. And my dad went to 85. She went to 92. Yeah, so we had her some extra time.
that's incredible.
Yeah, real stories there. But when she fed people, I mean, they knew she was up to something, but they still came and they still ate and they still listened to her pleas and they still did what she said. She was kind of a sorceress.
What were, before we close, I want to make sure I get their names. What were your father and maternal grandmother's names? And
Okay, so my father's given name was Chaim Tevye, which actually means good life. Isn't that interesting? But when he came to this country, he adopted the name Hy, and in legal papers it was Hyman, Hyman Levine. So he was called Chaim by some people, but he was mostly Hy. So my grandmother was born Minnie Golub was her family name, and she maintained Minnie all through her life. So those were their names.
And did she meet your maternal grandfather in the United States?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, they were both a little older than the usual romantic age. They were in their mid-20s. There was a lot of teenage marriages and young 20s marriages in those days, but they were I think 26 and 25 when they married. Yeah. You'll ask me about the birth of my mother, because there is a story and a half in that one. Okay.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and formally close out and stop recording.
Okay.
Okay.